Brazil, His Excellency the Ambassador of Ireland, His Excellency the Ambassador of Denmark, and His Excellency the Ambassador of Singapore, and Mr. Ross Batchelor, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of New Zealand, so we can begin our session and answer a lot of the questions that these young ladies and gentlemen have put on the table, and maybe we can answer their calls for new climate change. Your Excellencies, if you can please join me on the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you for your presence, for your attention, for your attentiveness, and for your participation. I am once again greatly honored to be sitting amongst such great leadership, great diplomats, and most of all, great people, because I believe each and every one of them is not just here to represent their country, but they're representing humanity in a sense. They are all fathers, they have families, they know that the future is fragile. And they also represent 5 countries that really believe that something has to be done. But before I start, I want to congratulate His Excellency Ambassador Thomas Anker, the Ambassador of Denmark, for his new position. And that position is the Danish Climate Ambassador, or the Climate Ambassador of Denmark. And this is a position that is not in a lot of countries. The good thing is that he will be handling that file as capable as it is. But the bad thing is he's going to be leaving Egypt, and we're extremely looking forward, and I believe in your new position that we can still work together and enhance international cooperation and development to combat climate change and work towards Vision 2050. I'd also like to thank His Excellency Sean O'Regan, the Ambassador of Ireland, for his support to this event and their contribution as the embassy to make this event possible, and all of the hard work and the time and support that our colleagues at the Irish Embassy have given us. I'd also like to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Domenico, the new Ambassador of Singapore, to Egypt, and thank him very, very much for taking from his time to be with us today. And of course, I'd like to welcome His Excellency the Ambassador of Brazil, who was the former Minister of External Relations of Brazil, and a person that has put a big mark on the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals. So while we are not dealing with experts, we are dealing with people that have actually put laws and regulations and have been leading this policy, international global policy towards climate change. I also want to thank Mr. Ross Batchelor, Chargé d'Affaires, the DCM of the Embassy of New Zealand, for being with us and for having numerous conversations with Global Trade Matters on what we can do and how we can bridge the gap and see what New Zealand is doing and learn from that. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll allow me, I'll start with His Excellency Ambassador Sean O'Regan, the Ambassador of Ireland, because this is an emergency, Your Excellency. And if I have done my homework correctly, Ireland has called for a climate emergency with a lot of policy changes and a lot of maybe even constitutional changes to come that are going to, how can I say, obligate not only the government but civil society and the private sector. And not just civil society, private sector and the government, but also their international partners through their A Better World international cooperation policy. So, Your Excellency, I'm not an expert in climate neutrality, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scientist, but I believe that there is so much that needs to be done. So, why has Ireland called for a climate emergency?
Thank you, Ashraf. And good morning to everybody. Look, I think there are a lot of things that I should, I suppose, own up to, confess to. In many ways, Ireland has come to this party later. reasons we come late is, well, there are a lot of reasons we come late, but one of the main reasons is our dependence on agriculture for export. But we have recognised that we have to change our behaviour. And by calling for a climate emergency, we are able to perhaps mobilise and influence people's opinions in Ireland. I'm also not a climate change expert. I'm a scientist. And one of the things that distresses me quite a lot about the whole climate change debate is the level of denial. First, the denial that climate change is happening. Second, the denial that it's happening because of human activity. When quite clearly climate change is happening, we in Ireland have been very badly affected over the past 5, 10, 15 years by extreme climate events. We're seeing more of them. We're seeing them more frequently. Whether it's unexpected and long snowfall in Ireland. When I was growing up, we never got snow in Ireland. Or because we've got longer, drier summers, sometimes longer winter summers, but this is also part of a pattern of change. These things warn us of what is coming for Ireland. We're a small island on the periphery of Europe, exposed to the Atlantic. Our climate is equitable because of the Gulf Stream. It keeps us relatively moderate and temperate for most of the year. Predictions of the scientists actually come to pass, we will lose the Gulf Stream. Ireland is at the same latitude as Canada. Everybody knows Canadian winters are long and cold, you know. Ours are not. This is one of the reasons we're able to put cattle onto grass for 270 days of the year and produce some of the best dairy and best beef in the world. But also our production of that beef and dairy, which is very, very important for our exports, is a major contributor to our emissions. 30% of Irish greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, as against an EU average of 11%. I think Denmark is up around about 20%, which Denmark is also heavily dependent on agriculture. And we're way off course in terms of reducing our emissions. We're about 12.5% below target, or over target, for 2020. And the trend is we would be 25% off target for 2030. So these are some of the reasons that we have to address climate change, and these are the reasons we've declared a climate emergency.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We'll come back to you, but I'll move on to Ambassador Thomas. Firstly, I believe when a nation comes up with the necessity to assign a climate ambassador, so this must be a very, very, very big portfolio and a very, very important direction to the Danish government that is, as His Excellency Shona Reagan had mentioned, is also dependent on agriculture, and so is New Zealand, and so is Brazil, maybe Singapore not so. But so how does Denmark see this from its national perspective, and how does it see it from an EU perspective as well?
Thank you, Ashraf, and thank you for the kind words. I want to start my remarks by thanking the children who are up here, and I would like all of you to, again, give them a huge hand of applause. And I'm saying this because in Denmark we've had a groundswell of demand from our youth for climate action. We had a national election in June this year, and a bit to the surprise of the older generation, to which I'm not usually counting myself, but I think looking at my passport, I will start to have to. The younger generation, including the young voters, overwhelmingly voted green. They voted for climate action, they voted for a green transition. And at the time of the election, more than half of the parties in the Danish parliament and most of the seasoned politicians did not see the urgency that Sean talked about, but our population and our youth did. And the new government that we have had to make the pledge, which was not even the priority of the main party, but they had to make the pledge in order to get the post of Prime Minister, that they would put into law the ambition to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 by 70% on the common European baseline that is in 1990. That for a small economy like ours, a small open economy, is a huge undertaking. We saw from the children that Egypt's contribution to global emissions is 0.5%. Denmark's contribution is 0.1. So people are arguing, why should we take upon ourselves the cost of getting to 70% when we are such a small part of the global emissions? I mean, the main culprits in the global economy is China as number one, US as number two, and then, well, if you have Europe combined, it's number three, but otherwise it's India. But between China, US, and Europe, that's about half of global emissions. The Chinese are a bit more than half of that, but we are so small and insignificant. Why should we take it upon ourselves? The answer given by our youth and now also by our leaders is we have a responsibility as a developed, rich country to take the leap forward and show that it can be done. If we can't do it, how can we expect anyone else in the world to do it? But going to 70% reduction, and currently the EU's ambition for 2030 is 40%. So that is almost twice as much as the current EU policy. We are pushing for an EU policy in a decision to be taken soon by European leaders to ratchet up the EU ambition to 55%. But that will also be a huge step. In Denmark, if you look at our mix of emissions, and Sean is right, we have about 25% from agriculture. We have about 40% from energy, and we have another 25 to 30% from transport. So we believe that we can go 100% fossil-free in energy. If technology allows, we think it's doable in transport. And in agriculture, like Ireland, we're still at a loss. Because what to do about all our animals and the gases that they emit, and what to do about, in general, our land. But that we will have to invest heavily in research and development to do. Just on the renewable side, on energy, currently Denmark has a bit less than half of its energy on a normal day from wind. And on a good day, and there are many days where the wind is blowing strong in Denmark, as in Ireland, we have 100% from wind. And we have emerged on a new energy partnership with Egypt, where we are offering our energy technology, our knowledge on how to manage wind energy, how to integrate it into the grid, how to balance it. We're offering that as a partnership to Egypt, and we just had the first Egyptian delegation from the Egyptian energy industry in Denmark last week. So we are trying also to help other countries to, in a way, learn from our experience, because we think that, well, our national effort, and that comes to my job, Ashraf, my job, as put to me by the senior ministers and the Prime Minister, is really to take our national ambition and translate it into foreign policy, to help outreach to countries around the world, to have an impact on the European decision, on the UN negotiations, and to make sure that the high cost that we will have to pay also leads to global action. The Danish Prime Minister last week invited all the major business leaders to a conference in her residence, and out of that came 13 climate partnerships with the private sector. So for each sector, whether it's shipping or aviation or road transport or cement or steel or aluminium, I mean, for all the major sectors of our economy, the leading companies have now joined hands with their business associations to promise to be part of our national effort, because they realize, as a government, you cannot impose on industry to do it, but you can say to industry, if you do your part, we as a government will help you get a global platform, we will help you gain a competitive advantage, because that's the way the future goes. We are the country in Europe with the highest share of green technology as our exports. It's about 10% of what we export right now. It's been growing steadfastly, roughly 30% over the last 5-6 years. We have another 6-7% of our workforce is in the green sector now. And we think, for example, that Egypt could actually be a leader in both Africa and the Middle East in green technology. And by doing that, you would create more jobs, you would create economic growth, and you would also green the economy. So it's a win-win. And that's the example that I will be trying to lead. So to sum up, climate neutrality in 2050 is a huge task. We think it's doable if you engage the government with ambitious regulation in partnership with the private sector. You have to bring in finance and technology, and then finally, you have to mobilize the youth, and you have to, in a way, bring that energy that the young people have into the political mix in order to mobilize society around the task. Then we have a chance at it.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for that. Thank you. Let me stay with the agricultural dependency in a sense. Now, back in September, Ross, your Prime Minister, as inspirational as she is from an outsider's perspective, she was very passionate about what she talked about at the Climate Change Summit in New York, the Youth Climate Change Summit. And I would like you just to elaborate on some of the, I won't say promises, but some of the ambitions that New Zealand has, and like both gentlemen, their excellencies, had mentioned, your dependency on agriculture in New Zealand is quite high as well. It's basically your main industry, coupled by a lack of proximity, really, to a lot of the other markets. So as Excellency Ambassador Anker was saying, why should we do it? And I'm sure that question also pops up in New Zealand as well. Why should we do it since we're not such large contributors to the global problem? So what is the general outtake of New Zealand now regarding climate change in Vision 2050?
Thank you, Ashraf, and thank you also everyone for having us here. At the outset, I should profess that I'm also no climate change expert. Many of you know New Zealand is a very small country, so we're spread very thinly across all of these issues, but I'll do my best to answer your questions. Let me perhaps echo the comments of my two colleagues, the Ambassador of Denmark and the Ambassador of Ireland. New Zealand, as you said, Ashraf, is a country that relies heavily on agriculture, and in a sense we would envy Ireland and Denmark's greenhouse gas emissions profile. 48% of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions come from our agriculture sector. This is significant. As the Ambassador of Ireland said, we wouldn't profess to be leaders in climate change. We're doing our best, but we have a long way to go, and in particular in the agriculture sector, it's especially difficult to address this emissions profile. Yes, our Prime Minister is actually a very quotable person, thankfully. She said recently at the UN General Assembly that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. I would agree with that. I think something that has been positive in New Zealand recently is an acknowledgement by our Parliament that climate change is real and that climate change is happening. The political debate in New Zealand now is simply about how we address it. So perhaps turning to some of the actions that New Zealand is taking, the most notable of late is just earlier this month, the New Zealand Parliament passed a law unanimously called the Zero Emissions legislation. This essentially sets a zero net emissions target for New Zealand in law by 2050. It also sets, unusually, a target for biogenic methane, which is a lot of the emissions that come from farming. to reduce those emissions in New Zealand. I think now that we have the Paris Agreement, the international community needs to move from ambitions and targets to actual action, and that's what New Zealand is trying to do with this law. And among other things, the government has established an independent climate change commission, which will be able to advise and support our government, but also importantly hold the government to account where this independent commission believes there is a lack of action. It is able to take measures to hold the government to account to ensure that we actually do our part. In New Zealand, we've also already seen the huge impact of climate change, whether it's with extreme and more frequent weather events as in Ireland and Denmark, but also with coastal erosion. New Zealand is predominantly a coastal country. About 70% of our population and the associated infrastructure is within 5 kilometres of the coast. So coastal erosion and these more extreme weather events are going to have a huge impact, social and economic, on the New Zealand population. But perhaps I'll take this opportunity also just to make the point about our neighbourhood, which is the Pacific Ocean. For our Pacific Island neighbours, climate change is no longer a prediction, it's an everyday reality. Many of our Pacific Island neighbours, the highest point in their countries is mere metres above sea level. They're already seeing soil salinisation and poisoning. They're already seeing flooding. They're already having to move their homes and factories to other places. So New Zealand and our international advocacy as well, we try very hard to amplify Pacific voices because climate change is happening, and it is happening today in the Pacific. So those are some of the things that New Zealand is trying to do. As I said at the start, we don't profess to be a leader, but we think that, you know, the small but significant steps we take at home, and we hope those can be a positive example for others to perhaps replicate.
Russ, thank you, but let me just stay with you on the same point that His Excellency Ambassador Thomas talked about. I mean, do these government policies and regulations come into effect because there is pressure from the youth of New Zealand regarding climate change, and that will result, as we move along, in elections and a change on a political level? So is it again a youth movement of pressure?
In New Zealand? Yeah, absolutely. So similar to Denmark, we've seen a huge increase in votes for our Green Party, and a lot of the other mainstream parties have been forced by political developments to have more green-friendly policies. Our Minister of Climate Change is the Green Party leader. The Green Party is in government in New Zealand. We also have a climate change ambassador. So no, absolutely, the new generation are voting overwhelmingly in support of the Green Party and green policies in New Zealand, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Russ. Really appreciate it. Your Excellency, Ambassador Dominico, Ambassador of Singapore, what a fascinating and fantastic country you have, and what an amazing success story, if I may, from a very, very small country with very little resources, very little human capital, to probably one of the top 3 most competitive nations in the world, ranking on not just the Global Competitiveness Index, but on the ease of doing business, on so many other indices, global indices, that prove that Singapore's policy and direction has been quite successful. As small as a country as it is, as big as a country as it is. You saw the presentation from the young gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen today talking about an actual realistic impact and positive impact on combating climate change in Singapore. What are the policies that you have undertaken and continue to formulate today that have resulted in what these young ladies and gentlemen showed us on the screen earlier this morning? Please.
Thank you, Ashraf. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for the warm welcome. Well, Singapore, like Denmark, is a small country, and we only account for 0.1% of global emissions. However, we are an extremely low-lying island, and should the sea levels rise by, say, 2 to 3 meters, then we could lose 1/4 of our island, of our country. So I think it is very important, therefore, for Singapore to contribute to global efforts, because everybody counts. If all small countries get together, we can make up a large proportion of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So that is why Singapore has decided that we will be an example for others to follow. So we were one of the first countries to sign up to the Paris Agreement, and not just sign, we have ratified as well. And we believe now it is time to move from talk to action. So we have already a previous target was to reduce our carbon emissions by 16% by 2020. And that target will be met next year. And so this year we announced a new target, which is to reduce our greenhouse gas emission and intensity by 36% by 2030. And Singapore, we believe in implementing what we announce. So we will meet that target by 2030. Other things that we are doing is that we are a small country with limited land area. So it is difficult for us to implement renewable energy, but we are trying our best. We are putting solar panels in all available spaces, for example, rooftops, and even in the center of lakes and reservoirs, we have put solar panels. So we hope to generate 10% of our energy through solar panels. What we cannot, for the rest of our energy generation, we have switched to natural gas, which is much cleaner and has much less emissions than normal fossil fuel, like coal or oil energy generation. Other things that we are doing is that we have started to put electric buses on the road, and we are also putting electric taxis on the road. So that will help to generate less carbon emissions. And we have this year implemented a carbon tax. So mainly for industries, currently at $5 per metric ton of carbon dioxide emitted. And this we aim to increase gradually to about $15 to $20 per ton emitted. So this hopefully will encourage companies and industry to reduce their carbon emissions. What people can do, and the younger generation are doing also, is that we can all do our part, which is to change our light bulbs, right? From the tungsten light bulbs, which generate about maybe per bulb 40 to 60 watts, which use 40 to 60 watts of energy, to LED bulbs, which only use 3 to 4 watts of energy. So we can personally, we can reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions, our own energy consumption, just by the simple means of changing our light bulbs. And for me, I'm doing that already, and I've done that in every mission that I've gone to. Every embassy that I've gone to, I've insisted that we change all the light bulbs so that we make our own small little contribution. So one more thing I think all of us can do is that we can grow more trees. And Singapore, we are a city, but we call ourselves a garden city, which means that although we have a lot of buildings and roads, we also plant a lot of trees. And I think I've seen some articles where it is said that Singapore is a net carbon sink because of all the trees that we have. So I think this is something that everyone can do, all the countries in the world can do, is to grow more trees. And this is currently considered to be the best way overall in the world to reduce carbon emissions if all of us can grow more trees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Ambassador Patriota, we talked about size from a smaller countries to Brazil being one of the largest countries in the world where you can fit so many countries into it geographically. Again, as we grew up, it's the Amazon. It's, you know, we've always believed that this is the most important place which contributes to our livelihood as the human race. And a lot of people might not remember that actually Brazil is a leader in the concept of renewable energy, almost 70%, if not more, not just today, but two decades ago, where your reliability on biofuels and within that direction. So you've been leading change in that perspective. But again, as the gentleman had mentioned, your dependency on agriculture, livestock, a lot of that, your coastlines, I mean, as many differences as these countries may have geographically or even policy-wise, you have a lot of similarities as well that are impacts of climate change. So you have played a major role on developing or participating in the UN development of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And especially that, if you would allow me, in that part of the world, maybe in the past 2-3 years, we've been seeing not a disconnect, but maybe a retraction from the principles that we as nations believe in terms of the Paris Accord, climate change, United Nations development goals, but Brazil has been sticking with that. And I would like you to just give us a broad perspective of what are the main challenges that Brazil faces from climate change, and what are the main opportunities that you see, as His Excellency had mentioned, you know, opportunities that come from a green economy.
Well, thank you very much. And I think one of the ideas that emerges from the interventions today from different regions of the world, countries of different size, and also in case of Brazil, in the case of the host country, Egypt, different levels of development, is that no matter how virtuous a country or a region may be individually, we will not meet the challenge posed by climate change if we do not cooperate internationally. So this is a universal challenge. And when you need to cooperate universally, where do you look to? You look at the United Nations, you look at the mechanisms that are already in place. The United Nations has responded, I think, in very forthcoming ways, not only through the conferences, and we can go back to the Rio conference in 1992 that raised awareness to all these issues, and then Rio +20, which I had the honor to chair the ministerial segment of, consolidating the idea that sustainability is of the essence when you speak of economic development. It seems like a simple thought, but prior to this international effort, we were still living with the idea that in order to deal with social challenges, environmental challenges, it would be sufficient to have high rates of economic growth. Well, this is no longer the case, and the good news, the positive news, is that we have an international platform, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, that has been universally accepted at the highest political level, not necessarily being implemented at the rate it should be, but still providing us for a roadmap. The Paris Agreement is an additional important accomplishment. I think we need to reaffirm our commitment to this agreement. Brazil recently hosted a BRICS summit in Brasilia, and if you look at the final communique, it reaffirms the commitment of all these countries, and some of the major emitters. Brazil nowadays is considered the 7th largest emitter, but certainly China, Russia, India are ahead of us in this respect. They all reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Agreement and to working collectively to reduce climate change. Now, I'd like to also recall here the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is a negotiated catchphrase, but that has some importance in discussing this issue, because even if today Brazil is among the 7th emitters, if you look at let's say, the Industrial Revolution, 850, and compare with 2011. I think that most studies have used that time span. More than 2/3 of the CO2 gases launched into the atmosphere were the responsibility of 4 major emitters. Of course, United States, Japan, China, and European Union taken collectively, and Brazil contributed with 1%. So there's a historic responsibility, and there's the, let's say, contemporary challenge and responsibility. And this brings me to the point of financing for confronting the challenge of sustainability. We must look at those in the most dire situation, the small island states, the poorest among the developing countries, the least developed countries, the poorest segments of our societies within our countries, because these are the most vulnerable and who pay the highest price for the changes that come with climate, with global warming. But we're falling way behind in terms of financing. There are multilateral commitments through the financing for development outcome of the Addis Ababa conference and others that have been taken. I think the Egyptian leadership, including Minister Hala El-Said, in a seminar that took place a few weeks ago here in Cairo, was pointing to the shortfall between the commitments and the actual disbursements. So this is a big question mark as well. And another way in which highly developed countries can assist those who are more vulnerable and less developed is through sharing technologies. You mentioned our energy mix. It's true that Brazil, among the countries of a similar size and degree of development, is by far the one with the cleanest energy mix. This has to do with our geography. We have tapped into our hydroelectric potential. But it also has to do with a certain degree of leadership and in promoting biofuels, as you have said. In Brazil, more than half the automobile fleet moves around on biofuels. It's the only country I've been to where you can get ethanol at any gas station or gasoline or diesel, and this has had a major impact. But to conclude these initial thoughts, I come back to the idea that it's a universal challenge and one that has to involve change in policy, change in behavior at the individual level, at the local level, at the urban or community or municipal level. And one of the hardest things for human beings is changing their behavior. This is why we need pressure groups, because not only do we have those who encourage the adoption of more sustainable policy, more friendly attitudes towards this cause, but we have also the other pressure groups who are trying to defend deeply ingrained interests of the fossil fuel industry, for example. It's understandable. The livelihood of many countries depends on these industries. But I think we need to reach some compromises here in order to ensure the intergenerational sustainability. And this is why it's so important, and I agree with my colleagues, to work with young people, to work with youth, because they are the living example of if we do not rise to this challenge, our failure will be paid by them. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. While the session is not open for questions and answers, I did promise the young future leaders to ask you this question, Your Excellency, Ambassador of Brazil. Again, most of the solutions that are put forward, one of the main ones that always comes up is let's plant more trees. And one of these young people did ask me, and I didn't check, and I don't know if it's correct or not, but he said, well, you know, a country like Brazil, you know, they already have so many trees, they just need not to plant them, they just need to keep them, again, referring to maybe some industries that might be taking advantage or resisting in that sense. So again, it's the Amazon is very important for all of these young people. I hope they can go see it one day and really see the true beauty of it and what it is. But how does the Brazilian government, it's sort of like the pyramids. It belongs to the world, the Amazon belongs to the world. So how are you keeping it in its pristine form, and what are the future plans in that concept? And again, it's one of the questions that these young people have.
Well, thank you. I actually spoke about several things, but did not address the Amazon in my first intervention, so this gives me an opportunity to come back. Well, I spoke of some of our strengths, the sustained energy mix that is highly based on renewable energy. But I think our biggest challenge is actually reducing deforestation in general and of the Amazon region in particular. We've had success in reducing this over a past 15-year period. However, deforestation has gone up again. One point that I think is important to make here is that although we have very progressive, I would call, legislation, we have a forest code that is among, let's say, the most progressive in the world, that requires you to replant if cutting down trees. So the point about planting that Singapore was making is not one that applies only to highly urbanized city-states like Singapore. It also applies to countries with large forests because of the sustainability aspect. So at one level, it's important to enact legislation and to have the sustainability concept incorporated into government activity. But at another level, there's the enforcement challenge. And with a huge territory such as Brazil's, Brazil is slightly larger than the United States if you don't include Alaska in the calculations, so enormous, and almost half of it covered by the Amazon region. It is difficult to enforce. And the places where deforestation is taking place are often very hard to reach, are in places that actually there's no land tenure that has been demarcated. So how do you combat this? I think pressure by groups, civil society, the media, academia, etc., plays a certain role. And international also awareness raising, if it is done in a bona fide kind of constructive spirit, can also play a role. But I think there should be no doubt left that this challenge is one that has been fully incorporated into, let's say, our national general attitude. In fact, Brazil is one of the few countries where our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Accord have actually been enacted through Congress as a governmental directive. So in every country, there's a very difficult consensus to be reached, or even compromises to be reached between the conservationist platforms and the more development, industrial, and highly polluting industries. It is not an easy task. And it brings us back to politics. If we manage to get the political debate to contribute to the right actions, and this is a task that every country faces nationally, but we also face internationally, I think we will make more progress than we are making at present, because clearly I believe it is insufficient. Thank you.
Excellency, I will stay with you with one more question that comes to mind, because this I can share with you so much more than our other panelists. The relationship between, and we were a country that almost 42% of our population lives under the poverty line, and I'm talking about the benchmark of about $2 to $4 a day. Maybe Brazil, I'm not sure of the exact number of the poverty in Brazil, but I'm sure it must be a little bit higher in terms of percentage than most of the countries that are with us. What is the connection between creating awareness to people that, at least in our case here in Egypt, might not have access to running water, not access to electricity, maybe not even good homes? I mean, our reform program has really been trying to work towards a better future for all Egyptians. But it's much easier, I guess, to convince and create awareness to people with higher education. Again, we have a high illiteracy rate. Our education still needs a lot of reform. So what does Brazil do to tackle that part? Because we've got to, like you said, it's an international, it's a global direction, and nationally it has to be a national consensus. Everybody needs to be aware of this to play their part. So are there any specific policies or directions that Brazil specifically, or if you can even generalize in other countries that might have higher poverty rates, how do you make that connection between climate change and telling somebody to change, their lights to LEDs versus they don't even still have running water or electricity, and so on and so forth? So that disconnect, how do you deal with that?
Well, this is a complex question that could take us into a lengthy answer, but to try to be very synthetic, I think the concept of sustainable development is the right way to approach this question, because what does it do? It connects the idea of economic growth, social development, and environmental awareness in pursuing these goals in ways that had not been present before in government planning. So you're right to point out the role of poverty, because if you are dismissive of inequality or of the situation of the most vulnerable in your society, you're not contributing to a sustainable development. And when we adopted the 2030 Agenda, again, the United Nations provides some guidance here. 17 goals were agreed upon, but there was one overarching goal that everyone should observe, which is the eradication of poverty. And this is something possible. We have sufficient material resources, we have sufficient economic financing to reach this objective, and of course the human talent and commitment to do so. It's a question of organizing ourselves better and trying to overcome the resistance to some of the changes that have to take place. In Brazil, many social programs have had an impact in reducing inequality. Inequality is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, by the way, within and among nations. And although we are in one of the most unequal regions of the world, and Brazil has been noteworthy for high levels of inequality, the relative good news is that inequality in Latin America in many places has been reducing over the past 10, 15 years, whereas in many other parts of the world it has been increasing. I think in the Middle East, for example, due to a combination of factors, it has been increasing, and it has also in highly developed countries. Now, this is not in conformity with the concept of sustainability. I think we need to tackle this very seriously. The conditional cash transfers, for example, that were attempted in Brazil went a long way towards eradicating, let's say, the most extreme forms of poverty, and we actually left the world map for hunger under the Food and Agriculture Organization. This is done every so many years, and so thanks to some policies that also stimulated family-scale agriculture, independently of the other agribusiness development that we have experienced. So I know that in Egypt, for example, conditional cash transfers are being also carried out through your government, and other policies such as these can have an impact. But again, I would stress the importance of working across these three pillars, which are economic growth and economic directed policies, social programs, environmental programs, with the eradication of poverty as an overarching goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you. Ambassador Domenico, I have a question just that, Ross also raised, and His Excellency Ambassador Antonio also raised. There's a regionality to it. So it's, we're looking at this as a global issue, yes, but Singapore is part of ASEAN, and the young ladies and gentlemen this morning in their presentation also looked at what the Philippines is doing in terms of some of the policies. So you're not alone, even within the context of ASEAN. And if we put all of the ASEAN countries together, I think you would be probably the third or the fourth largest economy in the world. I believe so, if that number is correct, give or take. So what is the ASEAN direction towards this, and how does Singapore take leadership in ASEAN regarding climate neutrality and climate action per se?
Thank you very much. I think, well, ASEAN would be combined a market, a region of 600 million people, with a combined GDP of about 2 trillion. So it wouldn't be third or fourth in the world, but maybe closer to 20th or something like that. But anyway, we are a region that is that will be affected very much by climate change, because a lot of our countries are coastal countries or island countries like the Philippines or Indonesia, and this sea level rise will affect all of us quite dramatically. So I think it is important for all ASEAN countries to also take measures. I'm unfortunately not aware of the specific measures undertaken by each country, but I am aware that within ASEAN we have a ASEAN Environmental Ministers process, which meets several times every year. And as part of that process, I'm aware that they are discussing specific targets, specific measures to take to combat climate change and to reduce greenhouse emissions. I'm sorry, I do not know the specifics, specific targets that they have in mind, but I do know that there is this process and that Singapore is working actively together with all the other ASEAN countries to collectively take measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Let me go back to Ambassador Thomas Anker. You were suggesting that you can, as a government, you cannot really force the private sector to do something. I mean, just recently, it just popped into my mind that you know, a certain country in Europe, or maybe not in Europe now, or still in Europe, that, you know, a government has promised that if they do come into power, what they're going to do is they're going to delist, for example, some private sector companies that are traded on their stock exchange until, you know, they sort of abide or align with the concept of climate action and climate neutrality and becoming carbon neutral. So I don't want you to comment on their concept, but how far can government go to set the private sector on track by creating laws and policies that the private sector, or maybe incentives that the private sector can depend on in participating into this climate action and, you know, walk the walk, not just talk the talk?
Thank you for that question, Ashraf. And I think the answer, well, it's a complex answer, but it lies very much along the lines outlined by Ambassador Patriota of Brazil, that in a way for our companies, as for any countries, they not only have to look at the national context, but they also have to look at the international, because many of them work in multiple geographies and multiple markets. So they have to look at their competitiveness and the level playing field at a global scale. That being said, we also believe that through government regulation, you can set a high bar that helps industry do the research and development and develop higher standards and better products, and in a way supports their efforts then to become leading in their particular sector and their particular area. And that's why it takes a quite sophisticated conversation between government and industry to achieve those right policies so that the regulation works with the business and not against it. In Denmark, all our leading companies now have adopted the SDGs that Ambassador of Brazil talked about in their business strategies, not as CSR, not as greenwashing, but actually as in terms of key indicators for their success, both in terms of their products, in terms of how they conduct their business, but also for their staff, the greening of their buildings, their energy systems, water, waste management, everything. And again, our young graduates, they don't want to work in a company that's dirty, that doesn't deliver and walk the walk itself. So there's a feedback loop here that is actually quite positive. One thing that we maybe have not really touched upon, except for the young people in in the beginning, and I just wanted, since I have the floor, to impress that urgency on everyone here. When we talk about climate neutrality in 2050, and we will have that national goal, Denmark, and the debate in our parliament right now is actually to have a date for climate neutrality that's earlier than 2050, simply because we think 2050 is not ambitious enough. But if you look at the International Climate Panel, the IPCC's report on the 1.5 degrees, the hard truth is that with the current level of emissions, the atmosphere will be filled with CO2 that will lead us to 1.5 degrees in less than the time we have to meet the SDGs, in less than 11 years, probably around 10 years from now, if emission levels stay at the current level. The impact will not be felt until years after because, I mean, it's not that linear. So we're treating our atmosphere as a global sink where we deposit CO2 which then leads to the warming that we see the impact of every day in terms of droughts, floodings, refugees, wars, etc. And we are almost, on a path where we will bypass the 1.5 degrees, let's be honest about it, which means that the Pacific small island states that Ross talked about will have severe problems, which means that the coastal lines of all our countries, including the Alexandria area in Egypt, our coastal zones in Denmark, in Ireland, will come under severe stress and will be underwater 20 years from now. You're still alive by then, Ashraf. This is not for our grandchildren. This is not in a far science fiction future. This is within our lifetime. And that's why we feel that the urgency for us to act nationally and then to translate that internationally is so big. And regulation from governments is a key. But it will take most governments around the world to regulate in the same direction for then our business to also have that level playing field where they can live up to their responsibilities. It's not feasible to do it in a small economy like the Danish one alone. Thanks.
Let me say with you, Your Excellency, as well, just regarding this point. My Danish friends, before they travel to Egypt or travel on vacation, they now ask, are the hotels we're staying in eco-friendly? Are the hotels that we're staying in environmentally friendly? So the same way that the youth in Denmark do or will not, want to work for a company that does not follow the Sustainable Development Goals or does not have a social responsibility towards climate action. Is it really now that the Danish travelers and tourists look at the hotels that they're staying in, and hence when they do come to Egypt, there is that question that comes up: where are we staying? What are the hotels like? What are the tourism industry? Because we have one of the leading people in tourism in Egypt, Mr. Hemi Zayed, with us here today. And we've got Laurent de Bouec from the IOM that is going to talk specifically about this migration issues, but on the tourism sector, so we can be more prepared for the thoughts and ideas and ideologies of tourists from Denmark.
No, absolutely. It's about how is the hotel constructed, how energy efficient is it, where does it source its energy from, what does it do with its waste, with its water, with its plastic. They ask all these questions. And amongst Danish youth, there's a concept now of travel shaming. So when somebody puts out on their Facebook page, I'm going on a trip to wherever, they will be shamed by their friends who are saying, how dare you? The carbon budget that this trip will cost, how are you going to offset it? I mean, there's a huge debate amongst the youth, and clearly the solution is not that they stay at home, but the solution is that they put more pressure on the tourist industry, on the aviation industry, to come up with solutions much, much faster than they had envisaged, and that's putting a pressure on everyone. Absolutely.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that, and I'm sure we're going to touch upon that on our private sector session. Ambassador Sean Reagan, the whole principle of this global approach that we have to climate action is kind of balanced between developed and developing nations. And if I remember correctly, if I've read correctly, if that number is correct on Egypt's national declaration, we require something to the extent of $73 billion for us to be able to participate, in a sense, in climate action. Now, like His Excellency, Ambassador Thomas was talking earlier, a lot of citizens of your countries would say, okay, why are we participating in this climate action thing since we're not such large contributors? And then we just answered that in a sense. But how do you even convince them? And I'm referring to a better world, that policy that you have, which does help and will help, if I understand correctly, your international partners through international cooperation and development towards climate action as part of it. So how do you convince the voters in Ireland and in Europe that, other than what makes sense, that they are contributing to the climate action of developing countries? How do you balance that?
Well, as the Ambassador of Brazil said, this is not an Irish problem. This is not a problem for individual countries. And I think it's fair to say that the Irish public recognizes this is a global problem. And we have a long and I would say proud history of multilateralism and internationalism. And I could talk about various parts of that, but our development cooperation policy stretches back 60 years or so, and we've been contributing to, our main goal traditionally was the eradication of poverty and eradication of hunger. The new policy, A Better World, sort of refocuses that a little bit and focuses us on helping the furthest behind first. And when it comes to climate action, partly because we're an island and we face very similar problems, a lot of our focus has been on the small island developing states. And we've given a lot of support to them, and we will continue to do that. But we also recognize, and I know there will be a panel later to talk about this, the impact of climate change in the developing world, however bad it's going to be in Ireland, however bad it's going to be in Europe, is going to be so much worse for those who are already in very, very difficult circumstances. And we're very, very anxious to address that. And the other dimension of that, and this is one of the next panel, I think, is the impact particularly on women. Women are people who make up the bulk of the agricultural workforce in the developing world. If you're not able to do agriculture because of climate change, you're not able to feed your children, you're not able to make a living. These things are going to be very, very profound in terms of their global impact. And the Irish people recognize that. And this is why it's relatively easy for us to say that we are going to double our spending on climate change in our development policy. And people accept that.
Can I say with Your Excellency on a point that Ross brought up, New Zealand and their carbon tax. Does Ireland have a carbon tax, or is this a policy that they're working on? Or so could that be in the means, the incentive, or maybe the carrot or the stick in a sense for the private sector, where we create the carbon tax? Because we don't have the carbon tax in Egypt. And I think on one of our sessions today, we're going to talk about the carbon exchange and how we can do this and how we can implement it in Egypt. And hopefully we'll be able to learn from your experiences and how to implement that.
Yeah, well, carbon tax in Ireland has, as it has in many countries, been quite controversial. I think it's fair to say that rather than take a head-on approach to carbon tax and simply tax carbon, we've changed the way in which we tax emissions and changed the way in which we tax cars to take account of and to incentivize the purchase of electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. So if you're driving a diesel or a petrol-powered car, you are going to pay much higher rates of annual tax on that vehicle than if you drive an electric one. We're also, as part of the Climate Action Plan, we've put in place a whole range of incentives to encourage people to go electric. The intention is that by 2030, all new cars being bought in Ireland will be electric. By 2030, our entire public transport fleet will be electric. And we're looking at different ways, different technological ways of reducing carbon usage. Because generally when you talk about carbon tax, you're talking about tax on transport. But we also have to look at incentivizing carbon capture, and that's something that we're doing through a very big tree planting program. Ireland is one of the least forested countries in Europe for historical reasons, and we can certainly afford to increase our forestation very, very significantly, and that's something that's being done. So that's a sort of a roundabout answer to the question, but it's my answer.
Thank you, Your Excellency. But Ross, I'll continue on the concept of international cooperation and development, and of course New Zealand has been a key player in developing countries throughout the years. So how does New Zealand foresee its role in terms of international cooperation regarding climate action with developing countries, and maybe within your region, not so out of it? I mean, you still do great things in Africa and you contribute highly on a lot of issues, but what is the main direction of international cooperation when it comes to climate neutrality?
Thanks, Ashraf. Well, I'm encouraged to hear all of us talking about the importance of international cooperation and multilateral fora like the United Nations, and like Ireland and others here, New Zealand has had a long-standing tradition of internationalism and multilateral engagement. I guess with regards to our development cooperation in particular, New Zealand is very focused on the Pacific. That's our immediate neighbourhood. This year our government announced $300 million in development assistance for climate change globally, of which we ring-fenced half, so 150 million for the Pacific. And that's mainly going towards adaptation programs, so risk and hazard mapping to allow these Pacific Island governments to be more prepared for the impacts of climate change, as well as renewable energy projects and food security projects as well. We've also provided $15 million in funding to the Green Investment Fund. They had their first replenishment this year, and a lot of that funding is also going towards the Pacific, similar projects there. So as I said at the start as well, what we try to do in our multilateral forums is amplify the Pacific's voice, because they don't always have the capacity to advocate for their interests in a loud way. And although New Zealand is a very small country, particularly compared to Egypt, we thankfully do still have the ability to advocate in a louder way than some of our Pacific neighbours. So that's what we're trying to do.
And just on a personal level, as a Kiwi, do you think the carbon tax in New Zealand is controversial? Has it been controversial?
I actually have to correct you, Ashraf. We don't have a carbon tax in New Zealand. We actually have an emissions trading scheme. So it's a market-led sort of incentive program to encourage the private sector to reduce their emissions. But in that regard, it has been controversial in New Zealand, and it goes back to the point around our agriculture sector accounting for half of our emissions. It's very, very difficult to reduce, with current sort of science and technology, very difficult to reduce carbon emissions from farming. But the government recently announced that we will include agriculture in our emissions trading scheme for the first time, which has put pressure effectively on the agriculture sector to come up with practical and useful ways to measure and cost emissions from farms. But the government has agreed to work together with the agriculture sector to come to that solution. I wanted to mention also another point with regards to international cooperation. New Zealand is the founding member of what is called the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Emissions. I believe Ireland and Denmark perhaps are also members. But Egypt is also a member of that research alliance. It's basically a collection of leading scientists from New Zealand and other countries who are researching ways to reduce emissions on the farm. It's one thing, we also have a tree planting program. We've planted 550 million trees in the last 3 years. But it's one thing, to capture carbon, but we also need to actually work to reduce the emissions. And so the GRA, this research alliance, is working towards that, and we're cooperating with Egypt in that regard.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ross. I think there was an announcement by our Minister of Environment yesterday, I believe so, that Egypt is planning to plant 1 million trees. That's been controversial, actually, at least on the social media response format. And of course, we'd like to see how they came to that conclusion, what it's going to cost, what they're planting, how much water it's going to take. So, decisions, again, we want to see action on the ground. So I think we're moving at least in the right direction. It's a good point. I've got another 6 minutes on the panel. So what I will do is I will take final personal comments from you regarding climate action, climate change. What are your recommendations to our youth, to the world, on a personal level, not as representatives of your country, but representatives in part of our human race? Your Excellency, I'll start with you.
Well, when you ask me what are recommendations to the youth, I think youth is actually taking the lead in some respects and kind of shaming the rest of the world into action. I think of Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who has had a tremendous impact. When we were preparing for the Rio Plus 20 conference in Brazil, we organized a large preparatory process with representatives of different sectors of society. And there was a youth representative that I received in my office, and he was extremely knowledgeable about climate change and the importance of education, for example, awareness, disseminating the concept of sustainability. And I told him, well, I agree with practically everything you said. And his response was, Mr. Ambassador, there are young people of all ages. So, we have to all become young people in a certain respect to be aware of what the outcome will be if we don't take the necessary action today. And across ideological lines or political priorities, become aware that there's no salvation without cooperation. Thank you.
Your Excellency. Ambassador Go, may I have your final comments and recommendations?
Thank you. Well, I already said that everybody can do their part in a small way. If all 7 billion people of the world change their light bulbs or adopt more carbon-friendly attitudes and practices, collectively we can make a difference. But apart from that, I think technology also is very important. All of us, we have the countries, all of us have to invest in research and development to find new ways to reduce carbon and to find more energy efficient ways of producing energy. More efficient ways of producing energy. I'm reminded of an article that I read some time back, and that is, at the turn of the 20th century, so around 1898, 1900, there was another emergency of a different kind. And the countries of the world, the leading countries of the world at that time, had a global conference. And they met because there was an emergency about what to do with all the horse shit. The world was actually drowning in horse shit because, the world was dependent on the horse for transport, right? And there wasn't enough place in the world to dispose of the horse manure. But the technology came along and in a way solved this problem, but created another problem. So now we have to find another solution to this, and I think the real solution will come from technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Ross, I'll take your recommendations as well on that.
I think to be brief. I think it's easy to fall into a bit of a negative spiral when we talk about climate change. So I take this opportunity to quote my Prime Minister again and say now is actually the time for optimism and hope. We can solve climate change. Humans are actually quite amazing. You don't need to go far down the road to Al-Haram and look at the pyramids. If 3,000-4,000 years ago we could build the pyramids, then we can address climate change today. So I would encourage young people, I used to be youthful once, I would encourage young people to be optimistic and hopeful and take action.
You'll still be around in 20 years like me, Ross, so
Unfortunately.
yes, we have to take lead on that. Your Excellency, Ambassador Sean, please.
Ross stole my line. No, I circle back a little bit to what I started with, and it's been mentioned in slightly different ways by others, but follow the science, follow the facts, and dig into the facts. Don't simply believe everything that you read. Look for evidence. And on top of that, yes, we do have the technology, we will have the technology, we can find the technology, but only if we use our brains, and use our brains more than our feelings. That's one thing, and I'll reiterate, there is always hope. Be hopeful.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'll close with Ambassador Thomas, please.
Well, it's famously been said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And the fossil fuel age will not end because we run out of fossil fuels. It will run out because we stop using them. So I will leave you with a few pointers. Number one, the urgency of getting to climate neutrality is bigger than you think. And the time is shorter than anyone might imagine. So urgency and shortness of time. Two, I am also an optimist. I think it can be done. But the main key here is, as former President Clinton famously said, the economy is stupid. If we don't get the incentives, the markets, the regulation right, so that business will do what it's best at, which is to innovate and produce, we won't get there. And the drastic action globally is needed in order to incentivize business and the private sector and research and development to get there. I do believe, and Ambassador Patriota raised this question, that now the money is actually out there. The mobilization of youth and of everybody has impacted so much on investors and capital markets that combined with the very low interest rates in the West, everybody is looking for a good deal. And the challenge right now is more the pipeline of scalable projects, especially in the developing world, is not up to what the investors are looking for. And I think there's in a way a mismatch in the market, and maybe this is where the UN and